Many, many moons ago, at least by internet standards, I made a video titled Coming to Terms with Reality. Some of my long-term subscribers might know it. So we can look at this video as a kind of continuation of at least some of the themes talked about back then, because I think we also need to come to terms with a new reality as it exists now. But I call this readjusting to reality. And there are a couple of angles I want to look at this from. The first and most important angle, I believe, is the disconnection between the generations. This is not a new topic per se. I've talked about it many times, but I think it's very important. Because inasmuch as the youngest generation in particular, but also young millennials, face a reality that is increasingly deviant from the experiences that we had in our youth as young men, we need to take into account that we mustn't reflect upon our experiences as necessarily appropriate for theirs. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm pretty sure everyone by now knows the boomer meme, right? It's a term used that goes well beyond the original definition of what a boomer was. And of course, the original meaning of the term was simply somebody who was born between the years 1946 and 1964. Of course, when people use the term boomer, okay boomer most famously, they mean somebody who is stodgy, set in his ways, and generally anyone over the age of 30. And not infrequently, I feel that this term is misused and abused indeed, in part because people work within the context of their circumstances, and if we had lived back then, we probably would have made the same mistakes. And I'm not a boomer, but Generation X. But on the other hand, what I do observe and can observe is that it is appropriate in some contexts, inasmuch as older generations in general lack either the ability or the willingness to move outside of their own sphere of experience, their own experiential box, so to speak. And whether it's willfully or not, this is quite damaging. Because what has emerged as a consequence of this generational gap is completely different perceptions of the reality we inhabit. And this has always been the case to some degree. But as we're all more or less digitally plugged in to varying degrees these days, I think that the older generations are truly remiss in what I view as a sense of connection to the interlocking generations that follow them. So we have this very strange situation, far stranger than any other generational gap, in part because the gaps between generations have been accelerated. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say the gap between somebody born in 1999 and somebody born, say, in 1979 is far greater than the gap that existed between somebody born in 1959 and 1979, if only for reasons of technology, if only for reasons of the environment that these people have been born into. And when you hear the same tired old advice trotted out from older people, it becomes irksome. I totally get it, especially when it's next to useless. And very specifically, not just in terms of the job market, what I've noticed in recent years is a continuation of a trend that has been around for at least a good decade. The kind of man-up stuff, the kind of tradcon stuff, the kind of PUA stuff that you could have easily heard 8 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, etc., in a world or global context where this is less appropriate than ever in terms of sound advice. I've seen people, for example, suggest that merely by engaging in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you will become a proper man, and therefore you'll be able to find your way through life. Now, I understand people are saying things as a proxy for engaging in some activity, and you might enjoy that activity, but that activity itself is not going to necessarily act as a proxy for anything. We have to understand, we who are older, Generation X or even older, that what the younger people are facing now, what the whippersnappers of our time, if you will, are facing, is a new social dynamic and a new sexual dynamic such that we cannot comprehend. We exist in a time, many of us, before the internet became a large presence in our lives. We can remember an environment where socialization was easier, where you simply talked to people, and where the distortion in the sexual market was not so great because the internet simply didn't exist, that average guys can also get access to females if they wanted. Now, the problem I have with PUAs, always have had, but also people who aren't officially PUAs, but trot out this tired old advice about do this or do that, is that it is coming from an experiential box, a bubble of experience that has nothing to do with the real, quote unquote, lived experiences of the younger men these days. So, for example, recently I was listening to a guy who grew up wealthy in Dubai, claiming that all you need to do is be really wealthy, work for Goldman Sachs, and get a fancy degree, and that will pave the way for you in life. But if you're pumping gas in Topeka, Kansas, you don't have those options. So this is what I mean. This is a guy who's completely cut off from reality, living in his own bubble, believing that his world is not only valid for him, but for everyone. And this has consequences. Because it doesn't make sense to take advice, if you wish to call it that, from people whose experience in life is fundamentally different and also emerged under different circumstances. And the same gentleman went so far as to make marriage recommendations, which make no sense whatsoever in today's world. So what can older gentlemen who are interested in helping younger men do? Well, for one, we can become aware of the situation as it affects younger men broadly. We can become aware that the sexual market isn't what it used to be. Of course, not everyone falls into the trap of only existing in their bubble. There are plenty of guys embodied in the statement, I really wouldn't want to be a young man these days, who understand how difficult it is, both in terms of acquiring access to sexual resources and or relationships, but also the quality of women available, the quality of the females. It's a double-edged sword, but in this case, the sword cuts negatively in both ways. Studying the circumstances as they exist today for younger people will allow well-intentioned men of older generations to understand the situation that much better, rather than simply projecting one's own experiences onto them and saying something like, you only need to do this and you'll be successful. When 10 years ago that might have been the case, 15, 20, 30 years ago, but it no longer is the case, because that's how quickly our world is evolving and changing. It's very, very rapid, these changes. And I think that needs to be the starting point. And we also need to acknowledge that we might not have the answers to all these questions yet, and we might never, but at least we need to be open and honest about that fact. There's another issue that has arisen, I've seen, where people are so focused on just getting theirs that they forget that no man is an island. So there's a video out there, for example, that refers to how the quote-unquote betaization of men is a good thing because quote-unquote alphas will get all the punte. Now that on its face is something born purely out of sexual competition. But when a person, and this is a pretty large YouTuber by the way, makes a statement like that, something along the lines of, well, it doesn't matter if the vast majority of men are cut out of the game as long as I get mine, he's missing the point. If we go far enough back, we will find ourselves in tribal situations that are extremely violent, extremely dangerous, because everyone is jockeying for a position as the head honcho, raiding and slaying his opponents, because that's what polygamous societies do. And they don't really lead anywhere. With the emergence of civilization, there is a notion that certain types of hierarchies need to be established, even if this was a subconscious notion. And without these hierarchies, you get a lot of disgruntlement. You get a lot of dissatisfaction. And in former times, they could certainly lead to some very precarious situations indeed. But when a person only thinks in terms of, what's mine as long as I get mine, they're missing the bigger point. We are not an island. We live interconnected in various ways. And if enough people, specifically enough men, fall by the wayside, whether that's simply in terms of the so-called sexual market, but also more broadly in terms of life success and just achieving goals, then there are problems. And so it's interesting that a so-called alpha would make that claim, because I always think the actual original alphas were quote-unquote leaders of men, and so they would take other men under their wing rather than denigrating them. But neither here nor there. And this also needs to be acknowledged by so-called elites. You cannot live in such a disconnected world and society such that a majority of young men eventually completely fall off the map and think everything's going to be fine. It won't be. So I think it's important in general for older men to try to connect with younger men, even if a direct solution isn't available, even if the experiences of the past are not as applicable. There's still something to be gained, right? And I think most importantly, younger men appreciate that kind of interaction because, let's be honest, most people don't give a rat's buttocks about the fate of young men these days. And if you take an interest, that might change things up, if only a little bit, and that little bit might serve as a spark for future endeavors. In any event, thanks for tuning in. Please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share the video, hit the bell icon to be informed of forthcoming videos, and if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. As always, may the gods watch over you. Take care, and bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.